The morning sun rose over the red mesas of Arizona, painting the desert in shades of fire and dust. In a small frontier town named Dry Creek, a crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's post office, waving small slips of paper in their hands. It was the day of the $5 marriage lottery, a desperate scheme cooked up by the mayor to bring women into a town of lonely cowboys. For $5, a man could win himself a wife, shipped in from back east or the border territories, ready to start a new life on the frontier. Among the dusty crowd stood Colt Henderson, a tall, quiet cowboy with a scar beneath his left eye and hands tough as rawhide. He had spent his life driving cattle and fighting storms, but he had never fought loneliness. When his name was called, the crowd roared. Colt had won the lottery. The men slapped his back laughing, saying fate had finally smiled on him. The letter said his bride would arrive on the noon train, and that her name was Rosa Gray. But when the train came howling through the valley, and the steam cleared from the platform, every jaw in town fell silent. Stepping down from the train was no delicate bride in lace or silk. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, her skin bronzed by the sun, her black hair braided with eagle feathers. She wore a faded Apache jacket, moccasins dusted with red earth, and eyes so fierce that even the wind seemed to pause before her. Colt's heart thudded once, hard enough to shake his chest. The sheriff muttered under his breath, "Lord Almighty, she's a giant Apache woman," the townsfolk whispered. Some chuckled, others crossed themselves. But Rosa didn't flinch. She walked right up to Colt, held out her hand, and said in a calm, steady voice, "You're the man who bought my name for $5. Colt froze. He wanted to speak, to ask why she was here, but all he could manage was a dry nod. The sheriff, feeling awkward, cleared his throat and declared, "Buy the papers. You two are married, congratulations." Then he spat in the dust and walked away, leaving Colt and Rosa staring at each other under the burning sun. That night, in the dim light of Colt's cabin, silence filled the space between them like a canyon. Rosa moved slowly, touching the walls, the table, the old revolver hanging near the door. "This place smells of loneliness," she said softly. Colt looked up from his chair. "It's a cowboy's house," he replied. "Not much use for flowers or comfort." Rosa turned, her eyes glinting. "You'll learn to use both." Her voice was calm, but something about it carried power, the kind that couldn't be bought or broken. As the fire crackled, Colt found himself stealing glances at her. She wasn't just tall, she was carved from strength, her every movement graceful yet unyielding. But behind those fierce eyes, he saw something else, a quiet sadness, like someone who had lost more than she could ever say. The days that followed were uneasy. The townsfolk mocked Colt behind his back, calling him the Sioux, Apache's groom. Some said he'd been cursed, others said he'd been tricked. But Colt didn't care what they said. He watched Rosa every morning as she worked, splitting wood, tending horses, mending fences, stronger than any man in Dry Creek, and though her hands were calloused, her touch was gentle when she healed a wounded bird or set a broken rail. Slowly, something began to shift in Colt. He no longer saw her as the giant woman who came from nowhere. He saw her as someone who didn't fit this world either, same as him. One evening, as the desert turned gold, Rosa sat outside watching the horizon. Colt joined her, silent at first. Then he asked, "Why'd you agree to this marriage? You don't seem like a woman who takes orders." She smiled faintly. "I didn't come for marriage. I came for revenge." Colt's breath caught. She turned her gaze toward the distant hills. "Years ago, men from this town raided my people's camp. They took everything, burned what they couldn't steal. I was a girl then. I swore I'd come back one day and make them remember." Colt's chest tightened. "And you think marrying me helps with that?" She looked at him, her eyes softening for the first time. "I didn't know your name when I signed the paper. But now I see you're not one of them." That night Colt couldn't sleep. He sat by the dying fire, thinking of her words. The woman he'd won in a lottery was not a prize, nor a burden. She was a storm walking on 2 legs. And somewhere deep down, he felt that fate hadn't played him for a fool. It had given him a chance to understand a truth he'd been running from, that pain and love sometimes wore the same face. As the moonlight poured through the cabin window, Rosa's shadow moved across the floor, quiet and strong. Colt whispered to himself, "Maybe $5 bought me more than I deserved." But fate in the frontier was never gentle. At dawn, the sound of hooves thundered through the valley. Riders, 4 of them, bearing rifles and wearing the red bandanas of the old Dry Creek Raiders. Colt recognized them at once. They were the same men who had once worked for the sheriff, men who'd built their wealth off Apache blood. Rosa stepped out of the cabin, calm and still as a mountain. Colt reached for his revolver, but she raised her hand. "Let me handle them." He hesitated, then lowered his gun. The riders circled, laughing cruelly. "So the giant squaw thinks she owns this town now?" One sneered. Rosa didn't answer. She simply stepped forward, her gaze steady as firelight. When one man spat at her feet, she moved faster than wind, striking him across the jaw so hard he crashed into the dirt. The others froze. Colt watched in disbelief as she faced them down, unarmed, her presence enough to make grown men tremble. When it was over, they rode off, humiliated, muttering threats they couldn't back. That night, Colt lit a lantern and looked at Rosa differently. Not as his wife, not as his burden, but as the one person who'd taught him what courage truly looked like. She caught his gaze and smiled faintly. "You're learning," she said. Colt nodded, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: peace. But deep inside, he also knew that this was just the beginning. The desert had its own way of testing love, and tomorrow the storm would come for them both.